All right, hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about Objective 12.3, describe the phases of the ovarian and uterine cycles, relate them to changes in the ovary and the uterus. So for starters, we're going to talk about two separate cycles, but they happen at the same time, so it can get a little bit confusing. Luckily, they're named pretty well. So the ovarian cycle all about everything it takes to cause an egg to mature. And we already kind of know that ovaries produce eggs, so that should help you be able to remember it, hopefully. The uterine cycle, more commonly known as the menstrual cycle, is all about the changes in the uterus or the lining of the uterus, the endometrium. The endometrium is what actually sheds when a woman bleeds and has her period. So, starting off with the ovarian cycle, and again, that's all the changes that occur to be able to make an egg. We are inside of an ovary right here. And it starts off before the egg is even produced. The precursor to an egg is called a follicle. And women are born with all the follicles they'll ever have, unlike men who continually produce sperm. So the first thing that happens here is we can see a bunch of teeny tiny follicles, and basically one of them becomes larger and starts growing, and we call this the primary or the dominant follicle. And you can see it's getting very large, and then right here is ovulation. So the egg, so there's the follicle, and it's develops the egg, and the egg actually bursts out through the side of the ovary. Some women claim that they can feel when this happens. I can't, but maybe you can. And then this little egg right here would be taken into the fallopian tubes where fertilization might occur. And then the follicle, or the leftover shell, starts to break down. And when it starts to break down, we call it the corpus luteum. So the ovarian cycle has two main phases. This first phase right here with the follicle is called the follicular phase. And then the last phase right here with the corpus luteum is called the luteal phase. I'll go over that in a little bit more detail. Here's a video of everything I just tried to explain. I highly recommend watching it. So the first phase, the follicular phase, when the dominant follicle is selected and begins to secrete estrogen. And this cycle is about 1 to 14 days, but it can change in length. And on the last day of the follicular phase, a woman ovulates or releases an egg. The second phase is the luteal phase, when the corpus luteum is releasing its own hormones, and this phase is always the last 14 days of the cycle. Now we're going to compare this with the uterine cycle or the menstrual cycle. This is all the changes of the uterus or the endometrium, the layer that sheds. This is also controlled by hormones, but there's a few more here. It's a little bit more complex. So your pituitary secretes, the little part in your brain, secretes pituitary hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, abbreviated FSH, and luteinizing hormone, abbreviated LH. And then the ovaries themselves have to be able to secrete sex hormones. That's why the ovaries are considered the primary reproductive organ in a female, because they can secrete hormones, and they secrete estrogen and progesterone. And the uterine cycle has three phases: the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase. We'll go through them next. So, starting off, we have the menstrual phase, which is approximately days 1 through 5. And if in the back of your head you can kind of compare this to the ovarian cycle, we'd be in the follicular phase of that. But back to the uterine cycle. During the menstrual phase, FSH and LH are beginning to rise, and estrogen and progesterone are very low. And what's happening literally in the uterus would be menstruation, or when a woman is bleeding. Most people bleed for 3 to 5 days, depending on how heavy your bleeding is. If you have really heavy periods, it could be shorter, or if you have lighter periods, it could last for a longer amount of time. Next, days 6 through 14 is called the proliferative phase, or the phase leading up to ovulation. During this phase, estrogen starts rising, and on day 14, FSH and LH both spike, so very high levels of them, and that actually causes ovulation. During this time, the endometrium is rebuilding So it got done shedding and now it needs to rebuild. And also, the cervical mucus is thinning. Remember how the cervix has that little like cervical mucus plug that normally prevents sperm from getting in? Because we're leading up to ovulation, that cervical mucus has to start thinning. And then the spike in FSH and LH causing ovulation. After ovulation, we have the last phase of the uterine cycle, the secretory phase, which coincides with the luteal phase of the other cycle we were talking about. Progesterone rises and then falls. Estrogen continues to rise and then also drops off. And if there has been no fertilization, then all hormone levels are going to decline, and that would start another period. The endometrium is preparing for an embryo, so it stays kind of thick, lots of blood, lots of nutrients, and the cervical mucus is going to thicken and reform the plug, because if we have a developing embryo in there, we want to protect anything from being able to get in. And then after that, it all is going to start over again. Oh yeah, and the corpus luteum itself will degenerate. Yeah, so then we would go back to day 1 and we would have menstruation if there's been no fertilization. I know that was a lot. This diagram is actually helpful. I want to encourage you to spend some time studying it. So let's orient ourselves here. This is showing the ovarian cycle. So right here we have the follicular phase where the follicle is developing, and then right here we have the luteal phase with the corpus luteum. And notice the light blue and the dark blue are both follicular phase, and green is luteal phase. And then down here, phase D is the uterine cycle. I gotta move my mouse so that we can actually see it. But we can see the 3 phases of the uterine cycle: light blue, menstrual phase; dark blue, proliferative phase; green, secretory phase. And then noticing that the menstrual and the proliferative phase are both included in the follicular phase. And then finally, these graphs are showing the hormone levels that I tried to describe for you on the other slides. So notice like estrogen and progesterone are both very low during menstruation. Estrogen and progesterone contribute to mood and help release neurotransmitters that make you happy. So that's why sometimes females aren't in a great mood when they're menstruating, because the hormone levels being so low. And then we can see this is the peak I was talking about with LH and FSH that corresponds to ovulation. And then rising and falling off again. Oh yeah, and this is literally the thickness of the endometrium. So we can see when it thins out and then when it grows back thick over here and then getting ready to thin again. Little practice problem. Hopefully make some sense. So this is Candace, and she is one of the 10 to 50% of women who naturally have a 28-day cycle. It's fairly rare to actually have a 28-day cycle. And she needs help being able to label her cycles on the calendar. Her period app says that she's supposed to start her period on Sunday, May 3rd, and her periods normally last for 5 days. So take a minute, pause the video, and try to map out the ovarian and the uterine cycles on here. And then hopefully we got the same answer. So she said that her period is supposed to start on May 3rd. And since her cycle is 28 days, I know that her follicular phase will be 14 days. So I color-coded the first 14 days here as the follicular phase. And then the last 14 days are going to be her luteal phase. And then if we add in the uterine cycle, she said that her periods normally last for 5 days. So here would be her menstrual phase. And then we know that the secretory phase has to be 14 days long because it occurs at the same time as the luteal phase, which is always 14 days. So I know the secretory phase is the last 14 days. And that means this space in between here is going to be the proliferative phase when the endometrium is rebuilding. And ovulation is going to occur right before this 14th day right here. So hopefully got the same answers. Here's another one. This is Aya, And she typically has a 20-day cycle, which is normal. Anything between 20 to 40 days is considered normal. She is not ready to get pregnant and wants us to help let her know when she'll ovulate so she can avoid getting pregnant. I'm supposed to get my menses on May 6th. I have a heavy flow that lasts about 3 days. So again, if you want to pause the video and work it out for yourself. And then this one's a little bit trickier because we're working with that 20-day cycle. We don't just know that it's 14 days followed by 14 days. The key piece of information that's going to let us kind of work backwards and figure this out is that the luteal phase is always 14 days. So she said that her period is going to start on May 6th, and she said that she has a 20-day cycle. So I just counted out basically 20 days from May 6th, which tells us that she'll end on the 25th. And then I know that the last 14 days of that have to be the luteal phase. So that tells me that the days between 12 and 25, those last 14 days, are going to be the luteal phase. So I know ovulation happens the day before. And that's why I was able to label it, where her follicular phase is actually only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days long, and then her luteal phase is 14 days. Hopefully I didn't lose you there. Email me if I did. And then she told us that her period lasts for 3 days, so menstrual phase in there. After that comes the proliferative phase for another 3 days, and then the secretory phase will always be 14 days, just like the luteal phase. And she asked about getting pregnant. An egg can be fertilized from 12 to 24 hours after fertilization, and sperm can actually survive in the female reproductive tract for up to 5 days. If it's just in the vagina, that acidity will break it down, but any sperm that makes it up into the cervix can actually live in the cervical mucus. So if you're trying to get pregnant, it's recommended to have sex multiple times in the days leading up to ovulation. So like on the 9th and the 10th, and probably the 11th and the 12th as well. But the really high fertility days would be like the 10th and the 11th. Let's think about this though. She could get pregnant if she had sex basically 5 days before ovulating. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If she had sex on here, she could technically get pregnant. It's pretty unlikely while she's on her period and while she's bleeding, but that's kind of scary. And then let's say that you're off by 1 day. Like, let's say that her period actually started on the 5th instead, or it started on the 7th. That changes her fertility window. That's why it can be so hard to predict and avoid pregnancy, depending on what you're trying to do. Finally, I just wanted to say that if you menstruate, whatever period products you choose to use are good for you. I do want to mention some sustainable options. I don't know if you've heard of period underwear. If you go to this link and watch this video, it's pretty cool. You can see she actually dumps a lot of blood into this underwear and they're able to absorb them. I haven't personally used these, but I do have friends who use them and swear by them. You can wash them out and keep reusing them. You don't have to put any pad in them or anything. The underwear itself just absorbs them. And then if you're comfortable using tampons, you might consider using menstrual cups. This is the brand that I use, basically because they have it at Target. And I got this dual pack, which comes with a larger size and a smaller size so that I could try it out. And I'm a big fan of these. So, a lot of options to consider for you. And yeah, I would love to answer more questions about pregnancy or menstrual cups or whatever you're curious about. Please let me know. Thank you.